Hey everyone, it's your guy back with another one that's been generating serious buzz across defense circles, online forums, and even in some classified briefings that I've managed to get my hands on. Okay, maybe not classified, but you get the point. We're talking about an ambush that went down just last month, Ukrainian F-16s. Secondhand, hand-me-down birds that were literally pulled from storage in multiple European countries against a Russian Su-35s, which is arguably one of the most capable air superiority fighters in Russian service today. And they pulled it off clean, real clean. The kind of operation that makes you sit back, rewind the tape, and say, okay, that was actually impressive, and I want to know exactly how they did it. Definitely worth breaking down in full, because there's a lot more beneath the surface than just a simple shoot down their strategy, their psychology, there's electronic warfare. There's decades old tactics being resurrected. And there are some hard lessons about modern warfare that both sides are going to have to absorb. So here's the full backdrop, and I want to set the stage properly because context matters. And if you don't understand the context, you're just looking at a headline. Right now, Ukraine is in a genuinely tough spot on the ground. No sugarcoating it, no political spin. Just straight facts, their inventory of medium to long-range surface-to-air missiles, think systems like the S-300 and the Buck is just about tapped out. We're talking critically low numbers, single-digit percentages of what they had at the start of this conflict. With Russian missile and drone strikes coming in nonstop day and night, sometimes multiple waves per day, they've pretty much stopped trying to intercept everything across the board. That's just not feasible anymore from a logistical or financial standpoint. Instead, they're picking their shots very selectively, going after only the absolute highest value targets when the math makes sense and letting the rest through, which means a lot of infrastructure in civilian areas are taking hits. But that's the grim calculus of war. On the other flank, those NATO-donated F-16s are arriving. But let's be real here. The number that can actually get airborne, stay airborne, and fight effectively, barely 20, give or take, spread across multiple airfields, with maintenance crews working around the clock just to keep those aging airframes in flyable condition. That's not a fleet. That's a handful of jets stretched across an entire front line that spans hundreds of kilometers. You don't go head-to-head with the Russian Aerospace Forces, which has hundreds of combat aircraft. With that kind of math, that would be suicidal, and everyone knows it. But Ukraine can't afford to look weak on the international stage. They need to keep the aid pipeline from NATO open. They need to show their backers in Washington, London, Paris, and Berlin that their investment is paying off. They need to generate positive headlines to maintain public support in Western countries. So they had to manufacture a win. They had to do something that would make headlines, something that would show they can still punch above their weight class, something that would keep the momentum going and buy them more time and more weapons. That's exactly what led to that carefully choreographed, meticulously planned ground air trap on July 8th. And the more you look at it, the more you realize just how much thought, training, and coordination went into every single move, from the initial positioning of the Patriot battery all the way to the final missile shot. Now, let's get into the tactical details step by step, because the devil is always in the details with these kinds of operations. How did they actually set the bait and spring the trap? First, they pushed a Patriot battery forward about 60 kilometers west of the forward line of troops, which is pretty aggressive positioning and carries significant risk, because if that battery gets spotted and targeted, you lose a multi-million-dollar asset and trained crews. They unfolded the multifunction radar, set it to low probability of intercept mode, and quietly turned it on, trying to stay under the enemy's electronic warfare radar and signal intelligence collection. At the same time, they were pushing real-time air picture data through Link 16 to their birds on station, giving them a common operating picture that most militaries would envy. That's the kind of integration that takes years to build, and they've managed to accelerate it dramatically with Western help. Then they launched 3 F-16AMs. One of them went down into the weeds, nap of the earth flying, hugging the terrain, using every fold in the landscape for cover, and crept into a preset ambush position with surgical precision, probably having rehearsed that exact route multiple times on simulators. Then it popped up, dropped a glide bomb on a target, and deliberately lit itself up on radar. They wanted to get spotted, they wanted to draw attention, they wanted to lure a Russian fighter into coming after them like a moth to a flame, because that's exactly what the Su-35's pilot would want to do: get a kill, add to his score, prove his superiority. Meanwhile, the other 2 F-16s were stacked low with AIM-120C and AIM-120D medium-range missiles, loitering in the weeds, waiting for the moment to strike, essentially acting as the hidden blade in this whole operation. The element that the Russians didn't see coming until it was too late. Once the ground radar picked up the radar signature and track of the Russian Su-35's formation, that's when things got really interesting and the tempo shifted dramatically. Those two covering F-16s with ground controllers, walking them in step by step, giving them heading, altitude, and speed corrections in real time. Exploited the Su-35's look-down blind spot, which is a well-known limitation of that radar's design and something that Russian pilots are trained to compensate for but can't fully eliminate. They came around low from the flank, staying under the radar horizon, using terrain masking to stay invisible, essentially flying in the radar shadow of the hills and valleys below. As soon as they hit the outer edge of their missile engagement zone, they punched the burners, pulled up hard, got radar lock, and let the missiles fly all in one smooth fluid motion that probably took less than 10 seconds from start to finish. Then they rolled off and dove right back down into the weeds to avoid any return fire, going defensive immediately, because they knew that the Russians would respond. And through the data link, they kept passing mid-course updates to those AIM-120DS. So the missiles stayed glued to the targets the whole way, even after the F-16s had already gone defensive and were no longer illuminating the targets themselves. That's the beauty of modern network-centric warfare. The Russian jets got their radar warning receivers screaming in their headsets. Yanked into high-G evasive maneuvers, we're talking 7-8, maybe 9GS, and actually managed to kinematically defeat that first wave of AIM-120DS, which is no small feat. You have to give them credit for that because those missiles are no joke and they're designed to be very hard to dodge. But here's the critical moment, the turning point of the whole engagement. Because they detected the F-16's radar emissions, those Russian pilots got a little too confident. They figured they were already outside the F-16's no escape zone. That zone where the missile has enough energy to catch you no matter what you do. So they pulled back on the stick, climbed again, and tried to reverse the fight, tried to go for a return shot, tried to turn the tables and make the Ukrainians pay for their audacity. But all that hard turning and evasive maneuvering bled off their energy. Their airspeed bled away, their altitude bled away, their options bled away, and their eagerness to reacquire radar contact put them right where the Ukrainians wanted them, right in the kill box, at the perfect range and angle for the next shot. That's when the Ukrainians flipped the switch, went to high-power radar mode, got a solid, unmistakable lock, and fired an upgraded R-77 variant with enhanced guidance, a missile that's specifically designed to engage maneuvering targets at medium range. This time, the cockpit warning tones went off like crazy. Continuous tone, no mistaking it. The kind of sound that every fighter pilot dreads, but the Russians didn't have the energy left to change the geometry or outrun the missile. They were in a low energy state, slow and low, and that missile was coming in hot. They could only watch that missile close in on their screens, second by second, knowing what was coming, and eventually they had to punch out. That's a tough way to lose a jet and a pilot, and you can bet that debrief was not a fun one. So why did this ambush work so well? Let's break it down because there are multiple layers here. Number one, the Ukrainians zeroed in on a long-standing systemic weakness in the Russian aerospace forces. This isn't a new problem. It's been documented for years by defense analysts. Number two, they played their own cards perfectly from start to finish, executing with discipline and precision that you don't always see from a force that's been fighting a defensive war for this long. The Russians just don't have enough AWACS birds in the air, period. They have a handful of A-50s and A-50s, but those are old platforms limited in their sensor capabilities. And they've been kept well back from the front lines because they're high-value targets that Ukraine has already demonstrated a willingness and ability to go after. The ones they do have are limited in what they can see, especially against low-flying targets, and they're vulnerable themselves to long-range surface-to-air missiles and even drone strikes. Add to that a real lack of effective spectrum reconnaissance and signal analysis capability across the board, the kind of electronic intelligence that would tell them where the Patriot radar was, what mode it was operating in, and what the overall pattern of Ukrainian activity was signaling. And from the very beginning of this war, the Russians have never been able to fully suppress Ukrainian ground-based and low-altitude mobile forces in the rear areas, because those forces are constantly moving, constantly adapting, and constantly being resupplied through Western logistics. That left a consistent, exploitable window for Ukraine to maneuver and strike from unexpected angles, and they've gotten better at using that window over time as they've gained more experience in better equipment. Now, the Russians aren't just sitting there taking it, don't get me wrong. They're not a static target. They do have their own playbook. And they're not stupid or incompetent, despite what some internet commentators like to claim. They often use coordinated air and ground-based air defense to track Ukrainian fighter patterns over time, building up a pattern of life picture that lets them predict where and when the Ukrainians are likely to operate. Then they push out Su-35s or even Su-57s, their so-called fifth-generation stealth fighter with their radars and low probability of intercept mode, using network search to cover more airspace than a single aircraft could manage alone. Basically using numbers and coordination to compensate for each jet's limited radar coverage, creating a web that's harder to slip through data link coordination with ground-based systems. They can launch long-range intercepts that are genuinely dangerous and have accounted for a significant number of Ukrainian losses. This is a very Cold War-style tactic mass concentration and coordination over technological sophistication, and it actually has worked in real combat situations. For example, on June 27th, a Ukrainian MiG-29 from the 40th Tactical Aviation Brigade was shot down by a Russian Su-35s from over 200 kilometers away during a ground attack mission over Poltava. That's a legitimate long-range kill, no question about it. And it shows that the Russians can and do punch back effectively, but there's a catch. This approach only covers the forward hemisphere, the direction the aircraft are pointing. Unlike a full AWACS that rotates its radar and covers the entire sky, these fighters are limited to what's in front of them. So the flanks are exposed, and that's exactly what Ukraine exploited with this flanking maneuver. It's a classic case of knowing your enemy's blind spots and ruthlessly exploiting them, which is what good tactics are all about. Now let's talk hardware in more detail, because the technical gap is significant and it's worth understanding exactly what these pilots were dealing with. Before 2026, the Ukrainian Air Force simply didn't have the ability to pull off this kind of complex coordinated operation at all. They lacked the training, they lacked the software, they lacked the integration, and they lacked the maintenance infrastructure to keep modern Western fighters in the air. The F-16s that NATO countries promised were all used hand-me-down airframes. Many of them were older than the pilots flying them, having been built in the 1980s and early 1990s. And 10 of those delivered weren't even safe to fly without major overhauls that took months to complete. To close the capability gap, starting in February 2025, newly delivered F-16s were upgraded to MLU M6.5 standard, which brought them up to a more modern software and avionics suite that gave them better radar processing, better data link integration, and better weapons compatibility. But even with that upgrade, they're still outclassed by the Su-35s in raw sensor performance when it comes to long-range detection. The F-16AM's ANAP G66 V2 mechanically scanned array has a max detection range against a typical fighter-sized target of under 100 kilometers, so it can't even fully exploit the AIM 120 DS 105 kilometer effective range in practice. Because by the time you're close enough to detect the target, you're already inside the missile's envelope, but you've had less time to set up the shot. Meanwhile, the Su-35's Airbus passive phased array radar can pick up similar targets at over 200 kilometers, giving the Russian pilot a massive situational awareness advantage and more time to plan his engagement. And paired with the R-37M long-range missile, they've scored confirmed kills at over 200 kilometers in real combat conditions against Ukrainian aircraft that never even saw them coming. So what happened on July 8th is a textbook case of using inferior equipment, but with superior tactics and ground coordination to take down a stronger adversary on paper, and the way they used ground-guided positioning combined with SAM coordination, that doesn't look like typical NATO doctrine at all, which tends to be more decentralized and pilot-driven. It actually gave a lot of old-school military buffs, myself included, a serious sense of déjà vu, because we've seen this movie before, and it involves a very different era of air combat, It reminds me of the air defense tactics that China used back in the 1960s and 1970s, and I think that comparison is worth exploring because history has a way of repeating itself in ways that surprise people. Back then, their main fighter was the J-6, a license-built version of the Soviet MiG-19. Armed primarily with cannons and early-generation infrared missiles, and the only domestic dogfight missile they had. The PL-2A was still highly unreliable in combat conditions, often failing to track or even failing to launch. The US F-4 Phantom and the Soviet MiG-23 were already equipped with semi-active radar guided medium-range missiles, which gave them a significant standoff capability that the J-6 simply didn't have. That's a pretty serious generation gap, no question about it. You're talking about second-generation fighters against third-generation or even early fourth-generation designs. But under those technical constraints, neither the American and APG-59 nor the Soviet RP-23 radar had reliable look-down, shoot-down capability against low-flying targets, because the radar processing technology just wasn't there yet. The J-6 was only a second-gen fighter by Western standards, but its low altitude and transonic performance was outstanding. Better acceleration, tighter turning radius, and better climb rate than the F-4 and the MiG-23 in that specific flight regime, which made it a dangerous opponent in close combat despite its technological shortcomings. So they came up with a ground-air coordinated strategy using the HQ-2 surface-to-air missile, a version of the Soviet S-75, as a high-altitude shield to keep the enemy honest and force them to stay low or stay fast. While J-6s flew low underground guidance, using the enemy radar's look-down blind spots to get behind them and force close-in dogfights where their agility gave them a decisive edge. And honestly, Soviet frontal aviation used similar tactics during the Cold War too. This wasn't unique to one side. It was a response to the same technical limitations before fourth-gen fighters with proper look-down, shoot-down radars showed up in the 1980s. This approach was highly effective and scored plenty of real kills in various conflicts around the world, from Vietnam to the Middle East. Who would have thought? More than 30 years after the Cold War ended, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union WED. See this same basic playbook brought back on a modern battlefield with modern hardware, with digital data links replacing voice radio and GPS-guided munitions, replacing unguided bombs. That's the kind of irony that military historians love. And it shows that some tactical principles are timeless, even as the technology changes around them. Now, to be fair, Ukraine's success here also owes a significant amount to Russian carelessness and complacency. And we have to talk about that honestly. Let's call it what it is. You don't get ambushed like this without making mistakes, without having gaps in your procedures, without assuming that the enemy won't try something bold. The Ukrainian plan actually had a vulnerability right from the start. The Patriot systems and MPQ-65 radar signature should already be in Russian spectrum databases from years of intelligence gathering, signals intercepts, and satellite reconnaissance. That's basic electronic warfare intelligence. And the Russians have had plenty of time to collect it and analyze it because these systems have been in the field for a while now. And low probability of intercept mode comes with real trade-offs, reduced data refresh rate, and limited multi-target tracking capability. Which means you're not getting the full picture of the battle space, and you might miss a secondary threat approaching from another direction. If the Russian patrol had been flying in a staggered, layered formation with a Waxen electronic warfare aircraft behind them providing overwatch and early warning, they could have at least gotten early warning of the trap, maybe even had a chance to turn the tables and catch the Ukrainians in the act of setting it up. But unfortunately for them, the Russian aerospace forces just don't have that kind of capability right now in sufficient numbers. It's a resource and readiness issue that they haven't solved. And it's not clear they can solve it quickly given the economic and industrial constraints they're facing. That said, they're not alone in this kind of defeat, and it's worth putting this in a broader context. Think back to the air combat between India and another country in 2025, India's Rafales, which are considered top-tier fourth-generation fighters with advanced sensors and weapons, were similarly painted by LPI mode radars and shot down without even getting a warning tone in their cockpits because the radar warning receivers didn't recognize the signal as a threat. So the bottom line is, modern warfare is all about the system, the whole integrated network of sensors, shooters, command and control, logistics, training, and intelligence. One or two advanced platforms don't win wars, and they don't guarantee survival either. You can have the best fighter in the world, but if your overall system has a blind spot, if your intelligence is lacking, if your tactics are predictable, you're going to get caught eventually. This ambush is a perfect lesson in that, and it's going to be studied in tactical schools and military academies for years to come. And honestly, it should be because there's so much to learn from it. All right? That's the full breakdown, no cuts. No shortcuts, everything laid out the way it happened with all the context and detail that this kind of operation deserves. I hope you found this as fascinating as I did because I think this is one of those cases where the real story is even more interesting than the headline. I'll catch you in the next one. Stay sharp, stay informed, keep your eyes open, and as always, keep thinking critically about what you see in the news. We'll talk again soon.